I want to explain to you how we're going to operate tonight. Being a former teacher, you have to have a plan. First of all, I'm going to read to you some material. Some of it is just states statistics and facts about Pearl Harbor and the ships that were there and the airplanes and things of that sort. Then I will read to you some material about three people who had a very close connection to Pearl Harbor: Ernie Berry, Dr. Felmley, and Jack Abrams. They lived here in Salem most of their lives, and the stories were really interesting, and I didn't know some of their stories until I started to do some research. And I'm also going to show you some artifacts that have been accumulated over the years. Then I'm going to show you a film. This is a documentary film, but it's a propaganda film. Those of you might remember the name of John Ford. John Ford's a big movie person, directed for years and years, did wonderful films. When the war broke out, the armed forces said, "We need photographers. We will give you a commission if you will be a photographer." So there were five Hollywood photographers who decided to take the commissions, and they went all over the world taking photographs. They did not all come back, and even those who did come back didn't get their jobs back. They were away for 5 years. While they were away, somebody else took their place, so they never really had the opportunity to pick up where they left off, except John Ford did, and went on to be one of our most famous photographers and producers and directors of film. So if you listen carefully enough to what I'm telling you, try to apply that to this propaganda film to see if you can figure out what it is they're talking about and what it is they don't talk about. Remember, it's a propaganda film. So it'll show you the attack on Pearl Harbor, and then there's a little section, about a 3-minute section of what happened after Pearl Harbor. So it'll keep your eyes on the screen to hear about that. So just to kick off a few things, Kay Tomasi's father was an air raid warden, and this is his helmet. I don't know how many of you might remember the fact that we did have air raid drills. My father was an air raid warden in my neighborhood in Leominster, Massachusetts, and I can remember his going out. I don't have an air raid warden armband here, but he would have an armband on and a flashlight, and he would just check the neighborhood. And if your window shades were not pulled down, he would pound on the door and tell you got to pull the shades down, because we don't want any light to go out. But he wore that hat and an armband. And I was a little kid that time, just 5 years old, and I used to hide under the bed. That was my defense. This armband was dedicated by Bob Hunter. This is an airplane spotter armband. There was an airplane spotting place on top of the hardware store on Main Street. The Moons owned it at that time. And then Bob's dad, and then Bob took over the building. But during the war, they used to sit up there on the roof looking for airplanes. There was also a spotting building here on the school grounds. So people would join that particular group of people to spend so many hours a day just sitting there and listening and gossiping, I think. At any rate, that's one of the armbands. When soldiers or sailors, whatever, got out of the war, they received a separation form. I'll send this around so you can take a look at it. This was Joe Fitch. Joe Fitch lived here in Salem on Thomas Street, and this gives you a little information about what service he was in, what he did in the civilian life. Here it says he was a painter. It tells you when he got out. an important piece of paper because all the vets would have this and they would use it when it was necessary, especially if they wanted to go on the GI Bill after the war. They would have to have some identification to do that. There are some other items which some of you may or may not be familiar with. When the war broke out, rationing came about. I mentioned this to my children, and they said, rationing, what the heck was that? I said, well, certain foods you could not buy. You could buy them, but they were rationed. You could only get so many pounds of sugar. You could only get so many pounds of meat. You could only get so many pounds of flour or butter. I can remember a sign going up one day in front of the butter and cheese store. It said, we have peanut butter. Well, we went and we waited in a big long line just to get a pound of peanut butter. And it was so scarce, but it tasted so good once we got it. And that's a ration book. The little stamps in there. You used it for everything. You used it for food, you used it for fuel. You could only order so many gallons of fuel for your furnace, or so many bags. You used to get them in 50-pound bags of coke or coal for your furnace. And you would have to use the stamps in the book. That was a way of controlling how much was available to the civilians at that time. They also had published at that time little books like this. This is a little different from the Air Observer book. The Air Observer book that my brother had, because as a Boy Scout, he was an air observer, but that book was in black and white and showed silhouettes of the enemy planes from the bottom, from the top, from the side, and that's how you were supposed to identify them. Now, these little books were colored pictures of airplanes. This one here is the F-4F fighter plane at that time. It was a Grumman plane. And you got a pretty good idea of what they are. It contains all the airplanes, plus the Japanese planes and the German planes. So you could study them during that time. Now I'm going to read to you some information about that day. I'd also like to remind you that this morning at 8:15, memorial service was held at Pearl Harbor for the remaining members who were at Pearl Harbor. And sadly, it said probably there would be only 2 or 3 that would be able to make it, because they have really dwindled in numbers, and those that were there would be into their hundreds or in their late 90s. So they were not expecting any more than 3 or 4 people being able to show up for that observation. So this is called a day in infamy. And present at Pearl Harbor, we had our ships, the Enterprise, the Saratoga, and Lexington. They were not there. They were the 3 ships the Japanese really wanted to destroy, because those were the ships that had our naval airplanes on them. But they happened to be out at sea at that time. Now those are the planes. The Navy planes actually fought most of the battles. And I want to point out to you the 5 planes that were involved in the Pearl Harbor attack. This little plane here is the Japanese Zero. This was their fighting plane. It was a very light plane, and it was light because there was no armor to protect the pilot from enemy fire. There was no armor or self-sealing gasoline tanks on this plane. It was very quick. It could shoot everything down that we had at that time, because our planes had not progressed that far. A Navy plane. This is another Navy plane. This was what they call this a torpedo their torpedo bomber, as you can see the torpedo on the bomber, or they could use it as a level bomber, which they did during the second phase of the attack on Pearl Harbor. There were 2 attacks, and the second phase was a level bomber attack. A little bigger plane, but a carrier plane. This was their dive bomber plane. Dive bomber plane carried 1 bomb. We had a version of a dive bomber plane, but this was the Japanese dive bomber plane, which when you watch the picture, you'll see one of our battleships blown up when the bomb fell down the chimney, and the ship, the Arizona, just blew up. And this is the type of plane that would have dropped that bomb on that particular ship. So these were the 3 principal planes. But I'd like to point out there were more planes than just these. There were hundreds of planes of all different types at that period of time. You had ground planes. These were Navy pilots, very well trained. But there were a lot of other support planes and training planes. Same thing with the Japanese. We had all kinds of planes at Hawaii. Some of them were double wing planes or biplanes. Some of them were really obsolete planes. We even had some B-17s on the ground without any guns, because that's the way they were flown in to Pearl to lighten their load. No weapons at all. So they were no help during the fight. Of the planes that were available, we had P-39s. I don't have a P-39 here, but it looks somewhat like this. This is a P-40. This is in the Chinese colors. General Chennault had been asked by the Chinese to organize an air force, and he did. Now the Air Force, there are seats up front here, guys. There are 3 seats up here. The Air Force was made up of volunteers. It was known as the Volunteer Air Force, but the volunteers were really trained Air Force men, Army Air Force pilots, who had to give up their commissions in order to fly for Chennault. Because at that point, we were not in the war. We were neutral. But they did. A movie, Flying Tigers, was made about this particular airplane with John Wayne and a few other people. But that was one of the models on the ground. This plane was not on the ground. This is an F-4F Grumman fighter plane, a naval plane. This plane was at sea with the aircraft carriers, as well as the Dauntless, which was our dive bomber. So those 2 planes and the 3 aircraft carriers, fortunately, suffered no damage during the Pearl Harbor attack. We also had 6 other aircraft carriers in the Atlantic. So in total, we had 7 aircraft carriers. Not as many as the Japanese Navy had, but at least it was 7 that were able to fly their planes and fight back. Now, the commanders of Pearl Harbor at that time, you had the Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who was commander of the naval fleet, and the American counterparts were Admiral Husband Kimball and General Walter Short, commander of the armed forces on the island. And I have to point out that during that time, communications weren't very great. Our 2 guys ended up being the scapegoats for Pearl Harbor. This was in 1941. They had to blame somebody, so they blamed them, and they took them off the job and put other people in their place. But the problem was, the men who were watching for airplanes with the radar system saw a group of airplanes flying in. And they said, oh, must be the B-17s coming in. And the group of B-17s were supposed to arrive. And so they didn't think anything of it, and they didn't call Central to say, hey, we got a group of airplanes coming in. They just ignored it. The other thing is, we did have, I would call it, spies who would try to break into the Japanese code system, which they did. They had gotten word that there was going to be an attack someplace in the South Pacific, but they didn't know where. Well, they got the codes, they typed them down, they sent it to the main office, and they sat there. Nobody bothered to decipher the codes. It wasn't until after the attack they deciphered it and said, oh, it says they're going to bomb here. Too late at that point. So mistakes were made. As the years went on, more and more information came out about just what happened at Pearl Harbor and where we failed, which we did miserably at that time. Now the battle results at Pearl Harbor. The Zeros, or the Zeeks as they were called, we had trouble pronouncing Japanese names, so we gave all their planes nicknames. The Cape, the torpedo bomber, which I just showed you, and the Akai, the dive bomber, was known as the Val. And they just sailed undetected into the harbor on that day. On the ground, we had obsolete Buffalo Brewsters, and I have to point out, the people in charge of defending Pearl knew that there was going to be an attack someplace, and they were always concerned about sabotage on the island. The island not only had Hawaiians there, but they had a lot of Japanese, so they were very concerned at that particular point. So what did they do? They pulled all the airplanes out of the hangar, put them out in the field, one by one, and to try to deter sabotage. Nobody can sneak into our hangars and damage the plane. Well, all the planes were out in the open, and of course they were destroyed because they were all out in the open. Other planes, Curtis's P-36s that I mentioned, the P-40s, some of the B-17s that landed during the attack, but they were of no help because they had no weapons on them. They had B-18s and some A-20s and other support planes on the ground. The Japanese launched 2 waves of 183 planes and then 170 planes. They destroyed or damaged 21 ships, including 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 3 destroyers. Only 5 P-36s and 5 P-40s got off the ground. In turn, the enemy destroyed 328 of 394 American planes and killed 2,330 Americans and wounded 1,178 military and military employees, not counting the civilians, in Honolulu. The greatest loss of sailors took place on the battleship Arizona, where 1,117 died when it sank. What did the Japanese lose? They lost 5 midget subs and 29 planes to ground fire and U.S. fighter planes. The attack was a success for them. It was a disaster for us. Now, after the congressional investigation, as I mentioned, Admiral Kimmel and General Short were removed from the commands, despite protests saying, hey, they did what they thought they could do based on the information you gave them, but that didn't help. They were replaced by Admiral Chester Nimitz, Admiral of the Pacific Fleet, and Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Pacific Fleet, and General Douglas MacArthur, who was commander of the Pacific Army in the Philippines. What most of us don't know is that on the same day when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they attacked Guam. There was little resistance on Guam. They weren't ready for an attack. And then they followed up an attack on Wake Island and Corregidor in the Philippines. And the Philippines fell in January of 1942, and General MacArthur was ordered to leave and go to Australia to be safe. But again, another major defeat for us. The Philippines fell. Now, what do? Here we are, we're stuck. We have been defeated in the South Pacific. The brainstorm was that we must strike back somehow. So 25 B. Mitchell bombers were loaded with their bombs and put on one of the aircraft carriers. There were 16 of them. They were led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. This was a one-way trip, and the airmen who flew knew this, that they were never going to make it back to the aircraft carrier. The gasoline they had would not do that. The idea was that they would crash land their planes in China, and then the Chinese would protect them and take care of them. Some did land in China. Others never made it to the shore. They just crashed into the ocean. In fact, I watched part of that movie today called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, if you ever get to watch the film. It's a pretty accurate film. Gives you a good idea of what the bombers went through and what the men went through, and then who protected them after the war. Some came back, most of them didn't. Did we do a lot of damage in Tokyo? No. It was a symbolic attack, you know. With that many bombers and only a few bombs, you dropped them and that was it. But what it did do was it boosted American morale, and it let the Japanese know that they were not completely protected from attack. But that's the last time we ever flew B-25s off the carrier. Now, after Pearl Harbor, tried to scratch our navies together, and the first major battle was in the Coral Sea at New Guinea. And it was a victory, but we ended up losing one whole group of planes. The PBF Devastator torpedo planes failed miserably. They were really outdated airplanes. In order to drop their torpedoes, they were flying like about 100 miles an hour. They were just ducks, in a sense, in a shooting range. And besides that, the torpedoes didn't work. It was a hard way to discover. So of all the Devastators that went out, 41 torpedo planes, 37 of them were shot down at that point. Well, they were done as a fighting plane. Now, the F-4F, the Grumman plane, was not a bad plane, but it was really no match for the Japanese Zero. The Japanese Zero could fly circles around this plane, and we did not have a really good kill rate with that particular plane. But in the works was a newer plane, and that was the F-6 Grumman, which is this one. And if you heard of anybody talking about the Grumman plant, the Iron Works on Long Island, that's where this plane was made. This was a faster plane, better armed plane. It could match the Zero in any dogfight. Now, a friend of mine, whom I met in college, said his dad was a supervisor at the Iron Works. The workers at the Iron Works were all women. The men were off to war. In fact, I met somebody a few years ago who said, "I worked at the Iron Works." And she was very proud of having worked at the Iron Works, building the F-6s. In order to keep morale up, he said his father would bring a band in. They would have a band every lunch. Everybody would just go down to the lunchroom, the band would play, and the girls would dance, and if there was any men around, they would grab them and dance with a man. But that was one of the keeping the morality, keeping their morals up while they were at work. You have to keep in mind that not only did women labor there at the Grumman place, but you always see that picture of Rosie the Riveter, which is a point in time when the women had to take the place of men in all these industrial jobs, which they did. And there was one group of women in particular, whom I always found to be very interesting, who flew the new planes that were made from the factories to the destinations that they were supposed to go, because the men, again, were on the battlefront. So you had women pilots flying these planes at that particular time, as well as other agencies, volunteer agencies made up of women who were assisting in one force or way or another. Now, another plane that was made by Grumman was this one. This is the Dauntless. This was our version of the dive bomber. It was an exceptionally good plane. It carried one bomb, just like the Japanese dive bomber did. But it was well armed, had a rear gunner in the plane, had machine guns in front, and was a resilient plane. It flew very well, and it could take some damage and continue flying. There were other planes that came along. This one came along a little later. This is called the F-4U. It's a Corsair plane. Again, a fighter plane intended for a carrier. Interesting story, two interesting stories. A friend of mine by the name of Roy Moss. Anybody here remember Roy Moss? Bruce does. Roy Moss was an engineer. He was in engineering school, and the Armed Forces put out a call to all engineers. We need engineers. Please come work for us. Roy Moss ended up working for this on this particular plane. And I asked him, I said, Roy, why is it with a seagull wing? He said, well, that was a problem. We had to figure out, that was for the speed and the aerodynamics of the plane. He said, but the problem was with the wings bent like that and the propeller being so big, it would touch the ground. So they solved the problem by bending the wings. The other interesting story is, when it was introduced as a naval plane to be flown off an aircraft carrier. And the Navy pilots had trouble with it. They did not like it because they said, we cannot, it's a big plane, that we can't see coming into the carrier, we don't like it. But for Lend-Lease, we had given some of them to the British. And the British took the plane and they figured out how to land this plane on their aircraft carriers. And it was sort of a sneaky way to do it. Instead of approaching it, as you normally would straight on, they discovered that if they came in on an angle, they could now look around the big front engine to see where they were going, and they worked out a system of landing the planes and taking the planes. The plane did become a very popular ground action plane, but it was also a good fighter. Pappy Boyington, I don't know if you remember Pappy Boyington or ever heard about him, but he was at that time an Army pilot, had a whole squadron of these in the South Pacific, and they just loved the plane in the South Pacific. It could carry a bomb, it could carry rockets, and it could also do a good cat fight. Now earlier I had mentioned the first bomb torpedo plane that we had, which got wiped out. This was its replacement. This was known as the Avenger. This could carry a torpedo or a rack of bombs. And it was a very good plane. It had a rear gunner. This could fly off carriers and became very active during the rest of the war. And by that time, the faulty torpedoes that we were using had been improved. So it made a difference. Now there were some other planes, which I don't have here. The King Cobra, which is the Bell 63, and the Lockheed P-38, and the P-51, and the Northrop P-61 Black Widow fighter, and the P-47 Thunderbolts were all planes that were built to be flown in Europe. And they were good fighters as well as the Navy planes. Now one day, one of my bosses knew I was interested in this, and he said, "I got something for you, Al." And he handed me this little piece of metal. And I said, "Yeah, what is that?" He said, "My father worked on B-24s in Michigan." He said, "This is from a B-24." And I looked at it and said, "Wow, that's pretty thin." I didn't realize that the B-24 skin was that thin. But then again, when the antique airplanes would fly into the Glens Falls Airport, and they brought in a B-17, I went over one day and did walk through that airplane, but you could see once you had this framed and riveted and put together, it was really a sturdy airplane, but very tight. Basically, I mean, even as civilians, we had to crawl through this plane because it was so small on the inside. And then I realized the one thing I would never want to be was a belly gunner. The belly gunner had to be a small person, could not take his parachute into the turret. There was no room for it. It was always outside of the turret. And of course, that's the last place you wanted to be when the B-17 had to crash land and couldn't get its wheels down. So being a belly gunner was not a good place to be. After the war in 1946, as a kid, there was an airport in Leominster, and they were putting on an air show one day. And it's the first time that I was able to see any of these planes. And on that day, there was going to be a B-17. The airport was too small. B-17 could not land. But it came in very low, so everybody could see what it was, and just, flew through a couple of times. And then following that plane was a P-36, and then a P-51. And those were the three planes I always remember, but that was an exciting day to be able to see those airplanes at that time. Okay, I'm going to read to you something about three of our Salem people who were involved at that time, either at the beginning of Pearl Harbor or at the Japanese surrendering, or had an impact on fighting in China. And I have to point out, and I heard people talking about it earlier, my uncle never said a word about the war, or my father never mentioned it. And that's true. When my cousins and my uncles came back from the war in 1945, my father took us children aside and said, "Don't you talk to them about the war, period." I said, "Okay." But that's the way it was at that time. Sadly, many of the veterans who came back, of course, had were shell-shocked, had various problems. Even one of my uncles turned into an alcoholic, didn't live very long after the war. He was a medic. I can't imagine what he saw as a medic in the war, but it just drove him to drink, unfortunately. And then I had a cousin who was in the war, never knew what he did. I knew he was in the Navy. Talking with my brother, who was also in the Navy during the Korean War, and my brother had said, "Yeah, I'm going to be buried in the military cemetery in Winchendon, Massachusetts." And he said, "I was talking with cousin George," and I said, "Where are you going to be buried, George?" And he said, "Oh, I don't know." He said, "Why don't you get buried in Winchendon? It's military base, won't cost you anything. Your wife can be buried there with you." And he said, "I don't have any papers. You had to have some sort of a record to show the cemetery people that you were in the military. I said, I don't have anything. And my brother said, we'll get them, which he did. Turns out, and I never knew this, my cousin George was in the Navy, but he was assigned to the transport ships that would go overseas to bring Lend-Lease weapons to Russia and to Britain. He said, yeah, he said there were always 1 or 2 sailors on board these ships. Some of them had guns. And he said, we were the gunners on those ships. And he said, I spent the whole war just going back and forth. I said, was it scary? He said, well, when you know you're sitting on hundreds and hundreds of gallons of Air Force fuel, yes. He said, because 1 torpedo, that was it. You were gone. But I had never known that was his job during World War II. Okay. Ernest Berry lived in Shushan, and he went into the United States Army. He was at Pearl Harbor when the attack occurred. He said they were in their dress whites. It was Sunday. And all of a sudden these planes started to come overhead and bombs started to fall, and then they realized they were under attack. So his commander told him, go inside and change into your fatigues. And then when he came out, he said, and get your guns. We're all going up to the roof, and we're going to shoot at these planes that are flying overhead, which they did, but they didn't shoot any down. But that's all they could do at that time. So Ernie was at Pearl Harbor. He was awarded the Pearl Harbor Medal and the Pearl Harbor patch, which they always had on their uniform. He then later on was in the Philippines, where he drove all kinds of military vehicles like ducks, other boats, transporting the troops to the beach in the attack on Pearl Harbor. And he said one day this guy got on, a general, it turned out to be General MacArthur, was on his boat. And so he ferried General MacArthur and his entourage to the beach. And we've all seen those photographs of General MacArthur getting off his boat, walking on shore. And that same day he got on the radio and said, people of the Philippines, I have returned. Because when he left, he said, I will return. So he filled that promise. Now Ernie, after the war, returned to Salem for a little while. He was a good mechanic, and then went to Troy, New York, where he met his wife and raised his family. Edie Meikle always tells a funny story about Ernie. He said Ernie was the guy at his church who would always get the wood and bring it in, so they would have wood for the church. And he said he did the same thing at home. He said he did that so often, he thought his name was Ernie Getwood. Now, at the end of the war, there were many areas where the news had not reached the enemy occupation. For example, in China, there were a lot of Chinese there fighting guerrilla warfares, of which Dr. Felney was one of those people. But the Japanese who were there didn't know the war had ended. So it was Dr. Felney's job to take his men and to go to certain cities in China to say, sorry, the war's over, you have to give up. But they wouldn't believe him because they had not received any official word. But in order to inform the public, airplanes had been flying over those areas, dropping leaflets saying, the war is over, Japan has surrendered, you can disband. But it was a scary situation because sometimes those troops would not believe Dr. Felney when he said, the war is over, and they would threaten him. At one point he said he walked into one place and he could hear the machine guns being locked and loaded. And he knew what the noise was. and he wasn't sure whether they were just going to shoot him or not. But he and a couple of other officers went in, talked with the Japanese officer, who somehow or other, perhaps he had seen a leaflet, agreed that the war was over and disbanded. Now, I never knew about Dr. Felmley. He was my family doctor for years, and again, he never talked about what he did in the war. He was a medal soldier. There was a name for that particular organization. In fact, Dr. Felmley was written up in a 14 volume book called War in the South Pacific. They mention him as taking on this task and going in. Trying to think, the name of his organization, I think, was the Rice Army. But they were basically a guerrilla outfit made up not only of naval sailors, but Marines, Chinese soldiers, and other guerrillas. Now, for his service, he received various medals, as other men, but it wasn't until 1974 when what he did back in 1945 was recognized. They were all awarded medals for bravery that said, for service from 1942 to 1945 in the defense of freedom from aggression from your Chinese comrades in arms of the Republic of China. The Rice Pad Navy had really served them very well. And then Dr. Felmley went on to med school and moved to our area and served here for 30 years until moving to Florida. Now, when the war ended, Jack Abrams, who some of you might remember, he had joined the Navy, and he was on a destroyer escort. And he was one of the first destroyer escorts to enter Tokyo Bay for the surrender of the Japanese. And he was always very proud of that. His destroyer escort saw a lot of action. They were there to keep the submarines away from the rest of the fleet. They were there to pick up pilots. They had been in some of the other battles, like Okinawa. And they were there to rescue American pilots. If you wonder what a destroyer escort looks like, you can go to Albany and see the last surviving destroyer escort. There's only one left. And you can see this on TV. Every once in a while there'll be an ad for that particular destroyer, the USS Slater DE 766. I visited that destroyer escort a few years ago. And again, I'm always amazed at how tight everything is. I mentioned the bombers. I mean, you had to crawl to get from where you wanted to go on the B-17. In the destroyer escort, you practically had to do the same thing. So people were really crammed into that destroyer. But the destroyer escort Slater is well kept. They love to do tours. If you ever get a chance, go down there. You can take a good look at it. It was well armed. But those were the little escort ships that would help to fight off submarines and kamikaze planes and to protect the rest of the fleet. So there you have it. 3 people from Salem who saw some exciting and perhaps horrendous things happen during the war, but they represented Salem. They did a good job. We were always very proud of them. And I think our Memorial Day parades, our 4th of July parades, our Veterans Day events that we have, we honor those people. Now, politically, we're going to watch a propaganda film. Recently, within the last 2 years, we've heard a lot of talk about revisionist historians. Well, I think a revisionist historian, in my words, is somebody who finds the facts and presents them, as such. There are always those that think, for example, Dr. Seuss. You all know who Dr. Seuss is? Dr. Seuss did a booklet during World War II called Dr. Seuss Goes to War. And it's a booklet about the Japanese. Stereotyped. You look at it today and say, oh, gee, makes me squeamish. But we have to keep in mind that he did, and people were criticizing him for doing that. I'm saying, well, wait a minute. We're in the middle of a war. It's a propaganda book. You take it for what it's worth. But look where we are today. Our former enemies are now our friends. There was propaganda on both sides. Hitler had a propaganda department that was terrific in that they knew their work. They put out all kinds of films. So it was not unique that we would be doing propaganda films only. They were done by all the countries. So when you watch this film, again, look at it from the viewpoint of what they're showing, why they're showing it, what they hope it will do to our feelings, emotions, because that's what a propaganda film is about. Now there's somebody I want you to look for in the film. His name is Doris Miller. He received the Navy Cross. He was an African American. At that time, African Americans could join the Navy, but they were never going to get a commission. In fact, the only jobs they could get were servants' jobs on board ship. He was a cook third class, but he did something during the attack at Pearl Harbor, which earned him the Navy Cross. He was on the USS Virginia, which eventually sank. Later on, he was transferred to another ship a few months later, and that ship was torpedoed, and he died on that ship. Look for him in the film and listen to what they say about him. Okay, are you ready for the film?
Your War and Navy Departments present December 7th. Early Sunday morning on the island of Oahu. On a hilltop, Uncle Sam lay fast asleep, warned of the fire that was licking across the oceans from without, warned of the dangers that were threatening from within, tired from wrangling with his conscience and fatigued after a long, dark night full of disturbing events, that indeed the year 1941 was. He slept in the early Sabbath calm. Safe and secure behind its military and naval ramparts, the city of Honolulu, like many another unsuspecting American community, was also asleep. At all the Army and Navy establishments on the island, After repeated warnings from the War and Navy departments, a number 1 alert had secretly been in effect for 11 days. This alert provided suitable defense against possible acts of sabotage and uprisings within the island itself, but made no provision against attack or invasion. At Hickam Field, the Army's bomber base, precautions were taken to safeguard the equipment against sabotage. Hence, on this Sunday morning, the planes were concentrated in hangars or lined up row by row on the open field. Immediately adjacent to Hickam Field is Pearl Harbor, the Navy's $100 million fist. Here, on this morning of a tragic day of reckoning, capital ships, heavy and light cruisers, lay at anchor. At anchor, too, lay several destroyers, tenders, minesweepers, and repair ships. 86 vessels in all. By 7 o'clock, the city began to stir. For the most part, the atmosphere was serene and quiet. At Hickam Field, ground crews were at work. On a dock in Pearl Harbor, a few bluejackets idled away a few minutes. At Kaneohe, a field mass was being held.
Shipmates, today is the third Sunday of Advent, the 7th of December, which means that Christmas is not far ahead. I don't have to remind you fellows that the old Earlene is about to shove off, carrying Christmas gifts and letters to the home side. Why not buy them a few presents? Might get Mother a Pikaki lei, little sister a blue skirt. I think they'd rather have something for little Johnny out here in Hawaii. This is the time when you're going to be missed. So, send them a present for Christmas. But that letter is so important, however. Don't put that off.
A few minutes past 7, an incident occurred at a temporary Army aircraft warning station. This station, as indeed the entire aircraft warning system, had officially closed at 7, but Private Joseph L. Lockhart, who had been receiving training here, was granted permission to remain at the station. While listening, he discovered something coming over the detector that alarmed him. He listened intently. Then, certain of his findings, he called the Central Information Center. An inexperienced lieutenant answered the phone.
Excuse me, sir. This is Private Lockhart. I believe a large flight of planes are approaching slightly east of north of Oahu at a distance of about 130 miles.
Must be wrong. We're expecting some B-17s from the mainland.
Thank you, sir.
This incident, where it acted upon, would have given our forces brief but precious time for defense action, and may have considerably affected the events of this fateful day. Regrettably, Private Lockhart's warning went unheeded. It was 7:50 a.m. by the clock on the Aloha Tower when the drone of planes was faintly heard. Out of the misty Pacific skies, like tiny locusts, they swarmed in from the sea. From the south. From the southeast. And from the north. At this very moment, on a quiet Sunday afternoon in Washington, Japan's smooth-talking, grinning envoys, Nomura and Kurosu, were blandly delivering to Mr. Hull a lengthy protestation of Japan's peace intentions. Yes, at this very deceitful moment, about 200 of Japan's messengers of death swooped in over our Pacific paradise. On they came, wave after wave, boldly, fearlessly. They had little to fear. They knew that our task forces were at sea, and they knew their disposition. They knew that no no long-distance airplane reconnaissance. No inshore airplane patrol was being maintained. They knew from detailed maps they carried with them the exact location of vital airfields, hangars, and other structures. Each was given a specific objective, and straight toward that objective he came. Over the cool Owl Range, past the Poly, past Diamond Head, and over Waikiki Beach, the treachery of an empire was on the wing. Planned for months with brilliant coming, favored by our lack of readiness, with the sky and sea all their own, at 7:55 a.m., hell broke loose. Man-made hell, made in Japan. the people, awakened by the bombardment, believed the Army and Navy were staging large-scale maneuvers. Scattered bombs, incendiaries, and machine gun fire had changed their minds. One gentleman, when interviewed by a reporter, was stubborn and refused to change his mind.
I don't think it is an attack by Japan.
You must have seen the Japanese planes.
No, I did not.
What about the bombing and gunfire?
I thought the Army and Navy were having maneuvers.
Look, Mr. Key, do you know that I know that you know that this is an attack by Japan?
I have nothing to say.
And judging by the smoke pouring out of your chimney, there'll be nothing left to show.
I have nothing to say.
The second phase of the attack began. wave of the invaders was beaten off. Yes, beaten off by our men, who against overwhelming odds, heroically and magnificently gave notice to the world that we had only begun to fight. When they sneaked in, they were about 200 strong, only about 150 when they departed. Behind them, they left about 50 of their planes. Most of them were scattered on the airfields in charred, twisted, and mangled wreckage. A few had crashed into the sea and were washed up on the shore. Some were shot out of the sky and plunged headlong into the harbor. Grim telltale evidence that the list of dead Japs might have been larger and the list of our casualties smaller, had we been sufficiently on the alert. These two-man submarines, 3 of which were accounted for, were especially built to operate in shallow waters, such as are found in and around Pearl Harbor. This piece of underwater perfidy won't be forgotten. Yes, this, as indeed the whole diabolical plan of the attack, was conceived and aimed toward achieving one objective, and one objective only: to catch us off guard, smash our fleet, cripple our standing as a sea power, and put us out of business. In this it failed. So tragic and terrible was the scene of destruction. Heartbreaking, the sight of ships built to fight and die proudly, now left burning in shallow graves. Painful and lamentable the scenes at Hickam, Wheeler, Kaneohe. with barracks, hangars, and equipment a mass of battered debris. Always, said President Roosevelt, always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. Those also were President Roosevelt's words. Horror and disgust, amazement and sorrow. Sorrow, yes. Bitter, grievous, mortifying sorrow. For on this Sabbath day, 2,343 officers and enlisted men of our Army, Navy, and Marine Corps gave their young lives in the service of our country. Who were these young Americans? Let us pause for a few minutes at their hallowed graves and ask a few of them to make themselves known. Who are you, boys? Come on, speak up, some of you.
I am Robert R. Kelly, United States Army. I came from Findlay, Ohio. My parents are Mr. and Mrs. James E. Kelly. I am Alfred Aaron Rosenthal, United States Navy. I lived in Brooklyn, New York. My parents are Mr. and Mrs. Henry L. Rosenthal. I am Theodore Stephen Zabel, United States Marine Corps. My hometown is Castalia, Iowa. Those are my parents, Mr. and Mrs. Stephen Zabel. I am Moses Anderson Allen, United States Navy. I lived on a farm in Cove, North Carolina. My mother is Mrs. Abby Allen. I am James Webster Lake, United States Navy. I'm from Huntington Park, California. My folks are Mr. and Mrs. William J. Lake. I am Antonio S. Tafoya, United States Army. I live just outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico. My father and mother are Mr. and Mrs. Jesus A. Tafoya. I am Lieutenant William R. Schick, United States Army Medical Corps. My home was Chicago, Illinois. My parents are Mr. and Mrs. William H. Schick. My wife's name is Lois.
You have a baby now, Lieutenant. He was born 3 months after Pearl Harbor. He's named after you, Billy. And you may be pleased to know he was born on your birthday.
Oh, that's swell. Thanks.
But tell me one thing, Lieutenant. How does it happen that all of you sound and talk alike?
We are all alike. We are all Americans.
Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy
bombing Nagasaki. Over. Ataro. His Excellency Premier General Hideki Tojo will report to the nation. For many years, the democracy of the United States has threatened to enslave the life of our peace-loving nation. That threat has now effectively been disposed of. I have the honor to report that our bombers have struck an annihilating blow at United States sea power. Here are the facts.
Almost immediately, the crowing began. Let's listen to the facts.
The battleship Arizona sunk and lost.
Regrettably, that's correct, Mr. Tojo.
The aircraft carrier Enterprise capsized and lost.
Incorrect. That's the old target ship Utah.
The battleship Oklahoma capsized and lost.
Capsized, but not lost. Plans are underway for righting her.
The battleships California, Nevada, and West Virginia finally damaged beyond repair.
Temporarily damaged. But just a minute, Mr. Tojo. Before you go any further with your facts, meet Captain H.N. Wallen of our Navy. He is the Bureau of Ships expert on salvage and repair. Together with hundreds of civilian technicians, machinists, welders, mechanics, engineers, many of whom were recruited from the mainland and working in complete harmony with Navy personnel, he began a 24-hour, around-the-clock job of salvage and repair that will stand forever as one of the great achievements in maritime history. Above and below the water's surface, this epic of masterful engineering went on. Captain Wallen has proved you a mighty tall storyteller, Mr. Tojo. He calls your facts by a rich Navy word, scuttlebutt. And from the very moment the attack was over, he set out to scuttle your kind of scuttlebutt. The 23-year-old California, known affectionately to our blue jackets as the prune barge, with her ugly wounds temporarily bound, was refloated and towed to dry dock. Similar attention was given to the 28-year-old Nevada and the 21-year-old West Virginia. Here in dry dock, in record-breaking time, they were overhauled and improved from stem to stern, from hull to peak. Now dressed in their up-to-the-minute fighting garb and raring to go, these mighty warriors and their proud crews stand out to sea. Godspeed. But wait a minute. Who is this saucy little gal, Captain Wallen? By George, it looks like that. Yes, it is. The mine layer, Oglala. A 4,000-ton surprise package. Given up and reported as lost, this former Fall River Line passenger ship was righted and refloated. Taken to dry dock, this small, dauntless craft was refitted and repaired. Now spanking new, a symbol of the fighting spirit of our men who build and man our ships, this veteran of World War I again takes up our battle station. Godspeed, old girl. So you see, Mr. Tojo, how poorly your facts stand up. Sorry to have interrupted.
That which is left of the Pacific Fleet is now in disorderly flight, seeking shelter in the Panama Canal.
Before you were lying. Now you're fishing.
All shipping lanes between the United States mainland and Hawaii are blockaded.
And now you're wishing. No phantom ships these, Mr. Tojo. But huge convoy from the mainland. 3 dozen ships, quite a number for blockade runners. And they're loaded to the gunwales with reinforcements and supplies. And here's a tip, Mr. Tojo. More of these convoys are on the way. Yes, convoy after convoy. Men in ever-increasing number. Supplies in ever-increasing quantity. For thanks to Washington's far-sighted program, we did manage before December 7th, despite many internal difficulties and disagreements, to build up the strength of our armed forces and start our factories humming. So that today, behind a heavy curtain of military censorship, Hawaii stands the greatest military and naval fortress in the world. Yes, virtually overnight, the island scene changed. War had come to America's tropical suburb, the Axis brand of war, a stab in the back Sunday morning. The din of the last bomb had barely faded when Governor Poindexter proclaimed martial law for the civilian population. Windows were taped in order to reduce the dangers from flying glass. Vital installations were camouflaged and protected by sandbags and barbed wire. Barbed wire, mountains of it, strung along every foot of Oahu's colorful coasts, strung across its highways, around its schools and its public buildings. Everywhere the earth was tunneled to provide shelter from shrapnel and strafing. Public squares, parks, and playgrounds were uprooted. Sturdy concrete shelters were built and distributed throughout the city. An efficient air raid warning system was put into operation, and for the first time in history, American school children were brought face to face with the grim reality of war. Even tiny little tots, confused and bewildered, were taught to march into zigzag trenches. How difficult to convey to them the why or wherefore of this strange game. Still more difficult to explain the need for these monstrous-looking things. But the fathers and mothers of Hawaii did. For this war is a war of survival, a people's war. Even a little people's war. Yes, your bombs, Mr. Tojo, brought many changes, and in no small measure served to further complicate the already complex life of the Japanese in Hawaii. But though to permanently erase their relationship with the homeland, they wiped out or removed every vestige of the written Japanese word. Closed are the language schools. Empty and boarded up the Shinto temples. Gone the flag of the rising sun. This young American Japanese gave the best illustration that over Hawaii, the rising sun had begun to set. Thus, war came to Hawaii, USA. The Aloha Tower, once the symbol of welcome and hospitality, now stands clad in weird war paint. No longer do luxurious liners bring vacation-bent tourists to these once happy isles. The liners, too, have gone to war. No longer is Waikiki Beach the sun-kissed playground of the Pacific. Barbed wire has changed its face, too. Now, at twilight, the city streets are empty and deserted. Blackouts start each day promptly at dusk. Well, you may crow, Mr. Tojo. You've done a good job of stabbing in the back. You've darkened our cities. You've destroyed our property. You've spilled our blood. Our faith tells us that to all this treachery, there can be but one answer, a time-honored answer. For all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword.
You may have noticed in one of those pictures the American star with a red circle in the middle. those were removed almost immediately. They discovered that the Americans were firing at their own planes because they thought they were Japanese. So they changed that emblem. You probably also noticed that there was only one picture of an African American in there. 2 African Americans tried to man the guns. One was killed immediately. They showed that. They didn't show the other guy at all. Didn't make any mention. Of course, at that time, they only knew what they knew. but again, he was awarded the Naval Cross by the President. Also keep in mind, even though Harry Truman said in 1946, all military services will be integrated, that didn't happen. African Americans were still relegated to minor jobs. I remember in 1957 I went to hear a naval recruiter at the University of Massachusetts. And almost immediately, a fellow in back of me raised his hand and he said, "Sir, when will African Americans be commissioned so that they can have leadership positions in the Navy?" And the guy thought for a moment. He said, "It's not going to happen today." He said, "But eventually it will." And it did. It took a whole lot of years. In 1970, finally, and it's not that African Americans were not commissioned. They were, but they were not given leadership roles. Might give him, some of them, commissioned, but given a leadership role of the guys who were sweeping the deck or the kitchen. All those subsidiary roles. But today that's all changed, and we know that. So a propaganda film, it was intended to boost our morale, which it did at that time. But over the years, a lot of other information has come out, so we have a better idea, of what happened on that day. And many books have been written about the attack on Pearl Harbor, and many movies have been made. I have a whole page and a half of movies that were made about war in the South Pacific. The last one that was made was 2001, called Pearl Harbor. Like this film, a lot of it was Hollywood. And when you watch the films, you could see where the facts were, but they also did things with the airplanes in that film which were impossible to do. But that, of course, was modern computer work today, not really flying scenes of airplanes. But here you had a little bit of both actual film mixed in with, and then some Hollywood things were thrown in as important to the public. You had a lot of emotion coming out of this film. But I can remember watching it in the theater. And as I was a kid growing up, it seemed like every movie I went to was a World War II movie. We didn't see them as propaganda movies. We saw them as movies that were there to boost our morale and help us feel better about ourselves, and also to support the war. In fact, at that particular time, at the end of every movie or intermission, a can would be handed around, and you had to make a donation for the war effort. So if you had a nickel, you would throw it into the can. And as kids, we all had these little cards that would open up with dime slots. You'd put a dime in the slot, it'd save us enough money. So when you had $10, you could then take it to the bank, and they would keep it for you so that you could buy a $25 war bond eventually. So war bonds, that's how the war was supported. We all gave things at that time. And interesting, as I look at education today and the history that we have to teach in the school, I'm somewhat disappointed. Not that they don't do a terrific job in our schools, they do, but there is so much history for them to disseminate. I open up the history book, and you can read about World War II in 2 paragraphs. That's it. They just don't get into it. There's so much to teach, and I think that's unfortunate. It's sort of like the argument today about civics. Who teaches civics anymore? Nobody. So we have whole generations of children who don't understand what their responsibility is, to their government, and to humanity, and to, keeping democracy alive. But there's some talk of bringing civics back, and I think I wish it were more than just talk. I think they should bring it back. We need more of that. Questions? Yes?
I'm not from Salem, if I can still ask a question. I'm from Granville, and my dad was at Pearl Harbor December 7th,
Wow.
1941. He enlisted in 1940. He was at the artillery school in North Carolina, and then sent to Hickam Field in the summer of 41.
Wow.
He was asked by the Army to write his impressions of that day, and I brought you a copy if you'd like to read it.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
his first-hand account of what happened on that day. It's old. It's a copy of an old article. This was published in the Coastal Artillery Journal, which is a military magazine in late 1942.
Right. I think Bob Payne, I don't know if any of you here remember Bob Payne. He went to that particular artillery school, and he gave me some stories about they were firing out weapons so fast that the barrels were melting. They just, just amazing. Would you like me to read this? Yeah, let me read this to you. It was Sunday morning. The ever-present rainbow and Kalihi Valley were in full display. As charge of quarters, I had cleaned up the orderly room, and when emptying the wastepaper basket, was attracted by high-flying planes. This was not unusual, even on Sunday, as Hickman Field was almost in view, and the planes were intermittently flying overhead. But these planes peeled off in a screaming dive, regaining altitude, and dove again. Distant thuds could be heard, and some of the early risers in camp climbed on the roof and could see a huge billow of black smoke arise at Pearl Harbor. Destroyers were steaming out of the channel amid geysers of water. Black puffs appeared in the sky, and that meant business. It didn't seem possible that we were actually being attacked, but it was confirmed by a wild shell exploding above and showering us with fragments. I immediately called K Battery out. We set to work loading ammunition and machine guns on the trucks and started for Hickam Field, our alert position, with Lieutenant Gillette in command. Kamehameha Highway was an endless stream of care and trucks, but with the help of MPs was soon in line. Sergeant Malloy from Massachusetts Corps, Mills, Michigan, and our gun crew were searching the sky for planes. But most of the activity was over Pearl Harbor and Hickam Field. Naval anti-aircraft guns were still throwing up shells, which we watched until someone threw what sounded like a package of firecrackers on the floor of the truck. I turned around, and there was a stream of tracer raking the road directly behind and tearing through the car, following us, sending it off the road. There was a Jap plane which had crept up behind us unnoticed, trying to strafe us with his machine gun. I swung around. Corporal Mills steadied the gun, and we started to pour 50 caliber slugs into him. The rest of the crew used their rifles, and Lieutenant Gillette, in true Texas style, hung on the running board and blazed away. Smoke streamed from the Jap's engine as he pulled away from us, and sliding into a shallow dive, he disappeared behind buildings and crashed. We proceeded through Hickam Field Gate, past the burning theater, and blasted Post Exchange, which later contributed tasty bits to our menu and hoisted our guns to the roof of the administrative building. There was a bird's eye view. The battleship Arizona was a mass of blazing oil. Several other ships were listing badly. Doctors were doing as much as possible at the crowded entrance of the hospital across the road, and the ambulance kept bringing more wounded. The huge concrete barracks next to the hangars was being gutted by fire. The lawn The large lawn in front was pockmarked with bomb craters and were now being accompanied by ground defense. The second attack was over, and after putting most of the island of Kehu in bags and hoisting them 3 stories, we settled down to a life of continuously being on alert until we were finally accepted for officer candidate school. The most inspiring part of December 7th was the post flag filled with vents and holes, but in historic American style, still flying. Thank you.
Who was this for? It's a picture of my dad that he sent home to his dad in November of 1941, standing in front of a 50 caliber machine gun. Just ironically, it was a month before the attack.
So your dad wrote this?
Yeah.
And what was your father's name?
Hicks, Robert Hicks.
Robert Hicks.
Battalion or whatever it is. He was sent to Japan to rebuild roads and bridges. So here's pictures of him actually in Hiroshima with his uniform, and the background just devastated and leveled.
Why? I think in my lifetime, I feel the most important thing we ever did in World War II was to not continue to see our enemies as enemies, but we helped them to rebuild their countries, like Japan, Germany. Of the countries, the only country that refused our help was Russia. Russia did not want any part of American aid in rebuilding the cities. And that's where we are today, unfortunately. Just one last item about my family. My father was 41 years old when the war broke out and had 5 children. He went to enlist and they told him to go home. You're too old, you got too many kids. But what happened in the town of Leominster was all the men who were in the, called then the State Guard, were called up. They were gone. But the higher ups felt that they needed a home guard. So all the guys who had been refused by the draft board joined up in the local State Guard, which was referred to as the Home Guard. And they did as much training as regular soldiers. They would, once a month they'd do their weekends. Every summer they would go to Camp Edwards on Cape Cod and spend 2 weeks there doing more training, and really took it very seriously. But I always remember my father being very proud of the fact that he was able to do that. Living in Leominster, Massachusetts was right next to Fort Devens. Every weekend, Leominster would be full of soldiers. Everybody would come there on a weekend pass. And I remember this was after the war, and I didn't know this, but my father knew it. German prisoners were being housed at Fort Devens. A 2.5 truck. We pulled up in back of it. And my father said, "Look at that." And here were guys in the truck that POW on their backs. And the next thing he knew, one of them was spitting into people on the sidewalk. My father was furious. And when the 2.5 truck stopped at the railroad tracks, my father jumped out of the car and ran up to the truck driver and said, "This is, gesturing, this is what's happening." And the passenger in the 2.5 got out with his carbine and went in the back of the truck and sat those guys down. And they went all the way back to Fort Devens under guard for doing that. But little things like that you remember, especially when you're a kid. My father felt, when he came back in the car, he finally said, "Phew, I finally did something." For World War II, even though he had been in the Home Guard. But any other questions? Yeah.
Not a question, but my husband and I visited Pearl Harbor, and they take you out to where the Arizona is, and they have it marked. That particular day, they had a burial of a soldier that had survived on the Arizona but was able to be buried there. So that's what they did with the people that did survive. They could go back and be buried with their team, with their people.
Right, that was
Very moving.
right. That was an interesting point because they decided not to raise the Arizona,
Right.
and that they would just use it as a memorial graveyard. And I didn't realize people could go back
Yeah.
and be buried there. That's,
Very moving.
yeah.
Yeah, because they take you to an area that's like a prayer area and tell you about, you know, the Arizona.
Mm.
Just very moving. It's something that we all should be able to do.
Yeah. There's another point that was not brought out in the film. Say, why were we so lax about Pearl Harbor? Why weren't we better defended? Well, at that time, the higher-ups thought that the depth of Pearl Harbor was too shallow for torpedoes. The Japanese knew that. So they altered their torpedoes so that they would ride higher in the water. It would not be bothered by not having enough depth for them. So, yes.
You probably already know, but I spent a lot of time in Hickam, and there's several buildings that are still there, and they never repaired the masonry. Still full of bullets.
So they're monuments. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank you for coming. I hope you learned something tonight.
Thank you.
Uh,